Joining us is Senator Rex Patrick from the Centre Alliance. Senator, you have spoken to Annalise and I about your efforts to have greater security checks for members of the executive. The report last night of the Chinese Communist Party seeking to put one of their own, basically, a candidate that they back into this parliament, must just embolden you in that effort.
Yeah, look, these are very serious allegations that have been raised and they must be dealt with properly. And indeed, they're part of a pattern and we must remember that. This is not a one-off. We've seen attempts at interference going back some considerable period of time. There's still a shadow over Gladys Liu in that she hasn't come out publicly and stated her position in the parliament. You might recall at the time I requested that the Prime Minister seek a briefing from ASIO in relation to her. That's not to say anything is wrong.
What do you mean she hasn't stated her position?
Well, she hasn't made a statement to Parliament about her connections with the Chinese. Now, once again, I'm not suggesting anything, but there is a shadow, and where there's a shadow, light can solve issues to make sure that people are absolutely confident in MPs.
So what would you like from her to do in the Parliament?
Well, she needs to make a statement to the Parliament. She has not made a statement to the Parliament since the controversy arose in relation to her connections, actually in the same electorate, but with United Front and other Chinese communist influences.
So you want her to clarify that she's never received money from any organisation like that to Parliament?
Well, she simply has to lay out what her connections were in the past, and I think that's important. But just going back to perhaps we can run back through ICAC, we can run back through Senator Dastyari. There was Miss Helen Liu and Joel Fitzgibbon when he was the Defence Minister. There was a controversy around this. We've had the hacking of the Parliament by the Chinese state. So there's a series of things that are happening here. This is not isolated, which is why it needs a systematic response. We do have our security agencies working on it, but for example, and I know you mentioned it with Senator Patterson about security checks, I just want to correct the record. The bill that I proposed did not suggest that ASIO would say yes or no to a member being a minister. The bill simply requires ASIO to provide a report to the Prime Minister such that the Prime Minister is informed, and it's still the Prime Minister's decision, and it's a model that is used in Canada.
And so the ASIO analysis wouldn't be made public. It would be given to the Prime Minister on appointing his executive or her executive. Therefore, it wouldn't be a public report.
No, it's not a public report, and the bill specifically states that the report is only to be used for that purpose and no other purpose and must remain secret. And indeed, a new Prime Minister can't look back on previous reports unless, of course, they wish to appoint the same minister into Cabinet.
The thing is, we don't know that Scott Morrison hasn't already done that. Like, that's a scenario in which he could have sought this report, seen it and acted in whichever way he thought was appropriate. How do we make it more accountable?
Well, because he can stand up and say that I have sought advice from our security services and there is not a problem. He hasn't said that yet.
And will you be seeking to speak to others in the Parliament now, the opposition and so on, to get support for this bill once again? Because up until now, the major parties haven't given you any support.
Well, there has been. I mean, this is the difficulty we've got. We've got something that does need to be addressed. We've got them not supporting a bill that sensibly seeks to have a security report provided to the Prime Minister in relation to Cabinet Ministers who see top secret information on a daily basis. We've also got the situation where the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme that was enacted 17 months ago that makes that creates legal obligations for Australians. Parliamentarians, the very subject of influence, the very target of influence, are exempt from that scheme. And the Parliament has not dealt with that. There was a recommendation from the PJCIS to deal with that. The matter was referred to both the House and Senate Privileges Committee, but at proroguement the inquiries elapsed, and it was only because I reinstituted it in the Senate that the Senate Privileges Committee is looking at it now. But once again, Labor and Liberals have both been weak on this. They've both refused to support a referral to look more broadly at the Chinese relationship with Australia by way of a Senate inquiry, something that would look at how we benefit from this very, very large and important player in the international sphere, but also looking at where we need to be cautious. They're simply censoring.
If we turn to Medevac legislation, that's something that's key this week, the potential repeal of that. We know your position on it, but it all comes down to Jackie Lambie. Have you been speaking to her about it?
Well, I have spoken to Jackie, and she is not supporting a repeal of the legislation. She is considering amending the legislation. I don't know the details of what she's proposing, and I understand she's talking with the government, but it's my understanding that she is not seeking to repeal that bill.
Well, if it's an amendment, you would think that it would be an attempt to give the government more power under the Migration Act. That's the problem that the government keeps citing, that when it was drafted in the first place, there was a flaw in that it didn't allow repatriation of those brought here under the Migration Act. That's their argument.
Yeah, look, there is a provision in the current bill that does allow for customs officers to seek to have someone returned. I don't know the exact reason why that is not being exercised, but look, if the bill needs some improvements, the Parliament consider.
Would you be open to that?
We would be open to sensible improvements, but what we need
not a repeal.
Not a repeal. We need to make sure that people who are ill, people who require medical attention, get medical attention. That's the Australian way. We've had problems in the past where it's just taken an unreasonable amount of time for people to get access to that medical treatment.
Are you concerned, as the government's been saying, though, that some people are potentially exaggerating or faking their illnesses to come to Australia because they know they can't be returned?
Oh, look, I don't know the exact details, but the people who make the recommendation for these people to come back are in fact medical doctors, and I'm not going to second guess what their opinions are.
And finally, on the Ensuring Integrity Bill, do you think that the government will have the numbers now to get that through? I know that you've had negotiations with the government and had amendments put. Do you think that the deal will be done?
Yeah, so we've negotiated with the government to make sure that the good unions are not harmed by this bill. There are a series of measures that must be looked at in totality that protect the good unions, but it will deal with unions that have been persistently breaking the law. We can't have that in a country where the rule of law is a fundamental tenement. Those amendments, or the amendments released by the government, reflect the discussions that we had with them. I know that Senator Hanson put out some amendments late last week. We are supportive of those. If indeed Centre Alliance were to support the bill, as we've indicated, and One Nation were to do the same, it will get past the Senate this week.
Do you agree with Labor's been saying it's a bit of a double standard, that unions can have a few paperwork issues and be deregistered, banks can breach anti-money laundering issues 23 million times and not receive any kind of backlash?
In the last sitting week of Parliament, when we were dealing with Big Stick, I put an amendment up that extended court-ordered divestiture of companies that engage in misconduct, allowing a court to dismantle a company in effect, and Labor did not support it. So, there's some duplicitous statements being made.
Senator Patrick, we're out of time. We appreciate your time. A busy day at the start of this sitting fortnight. Thanks.
Thank you very much.